here on the podcast with Mr. Will Spencer from the Winston Cup Museum and Special Events Center. Will, thanks for taking some time. It's pretty cool. I've actually never been here, and first driving in, you got a lot of the old style logos and signs up, and the big mural up on the sidewall as you go to park of just kind of all the memories from a lot of my childhood in the 90s and stuff I watched before in the 80s. It's almost like a time machine of certain, a little bit, walking in here just to kind of see. It's crazy to see how far things have come. And off the top, I appreciate you even having any of this so that people can even see about it, because people born in the 2000s have no real honest clue about kind of where the sport kind of come from, at least in the Winston era of the 70s. So even just to me off the top, it's pretty cool just to see how far the sport really has come.
Well, thank you for having me, Tyler. The museum is a really neat place. It was kind of in 2001 where Reynolds was with the Master Settlement Agreement. They got out of the Winston Racing Series, and we looked after JKS, which is the parent company or the owner of the museum. We looked after 97 Winston Racing Series tracks, plus we did NHRA, the Winston Drag Racing, and the Winston Cup. So JKS supported the series, those three different series over a 25-year period. I started JKS in '83, '84, and the first piece that I did for Reynolds was the press conference at the Reynolds building for the Winston. And Jerry Long put up $1 million for everybody to win. And we had a little podium sign and a banner, and Jerry announced what they were going to do and what it was going to be called, the Winston. So it was one of those pieces that when it started, in the museum basically chronicles from 1971 to 2003, the 33 years that Reynolds was part of the sport or the series sponsor. In 2003, I was tasked, like I was in 2 for drag racing and 1 for the racing series, was to shut it down, end it big, figure out how we could do what had been done over that 33-year period. So there were a couple of things that happened. It happened really fast. We developed a logo. It was called the Victory Lap Tour, and it represented the 18, they were 18, I'll get that right, 18 champions over the 33 years. So we created cars that basically represented, in the period, they were current day cars, they were 2002 or 3s, the cars that went to the racetracks that were the throwback paint scheme, which was really cool with the Victory Lap logo. So we have, in the museum in the Victory Lane, we have Matt Kenseth's Victory Lap car in the Victory Lanes, because he was the last champion. But what I knew from what we had done over that 25 plus years was that as the cars changed and the show cars changed, well, the cars changed, a lot of cars became show cars, the X-race cars. When they became changed or became outdated to where it was, you couldn't upgrade that car to be a current car. I used to tell everybody, Bill Soper, which runs the museum, take it to the warehouse. One day I'm going to do a museum.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a.
You kind of saw this coming.
It was kind of a joke, but that was over a 25-year period. Like the car here in the lobby is the first Winston show car. It was built by Junior Johnson up in Ingle Hollow. It runs. It's a statement to the commitment to the sport that Reynolds had in 1971. For me, 1971, my first race was at Rockingham with a friend of mine's dad who worked at Reynolds, and he had tickets. And I can still remember Cale Yarborough and Richard Petty going at it, for the win. But through time, with the museum, with Reynolds getting out and pretty much the master settlement change in their business model, 2003 was a big year to be able to document everything that was through that 33-year period and be able to get a lot of the items that Reynolds had. I mean, the perpetual trophies here, which there's a sister to it that NASCAR has. It's in a case, and it used to be in the lobby at the Reynolds building. There are lots of pictures here that were in sports marketing. The Victory Lap series of pictures that were done. We did one for the driver, and Reynolds had one. They're all actually here, except for Darrell Waltrips is missing. He's still on the Victory Lap tour.
Okay.
We don't know what happened to him. So the mural here depicts who was where and when. It's 250 feet long, and it starts in 1971 and goes to 2003. So like my good friend Richard Childress is in there in the 80s, but he kind of gets pulled into the picture. He was never a champion, but he's been a hell of a car owner.
Yeah.
And so it kind of chronicles that period where he was and the transition to Dale to drive his car and where Dale ended up, and then Junior came into the sport. So it took about 6 months. All of these pictures that are in the mural are original pictures that were taken by Reynolds through that 33 years.
It's amazing just when I actually looked at just a piece of the research, just how involved Winston was. It wasn't just paying for naming rights and go have fun with it. It was a very serious involvement, even down to just looking at the Winston and the All-Star race, and just how involved they really were. I mean, it seemed like they put everything they had into not just growing the sport, but I mean, obviously to help make themselves look good. It just seemed like a lot more of a commitment than maybe you would think if you didn't look at like the details.
For what we did for Winston Racing Series, Winston Drag, and the Cup Series, they didn't spare any expense. They built suites. They supplied the tracks with all the red and white paint, signage. We called it was a agreement with the tracks for the Cup Series. It was called EPP is what it was, but it was basically the signage rights at everywhere from Rockingham to Wilkesboro to Darlington to Talladega. They built the victory lanes. They were very supportive of, revamping racetracks, the smaller tracks, if it was South Boston or Caraway. Their commitment, they put their name on it. They were only going to do it one way, and that was right. And that was a great piece for JKS, but a greater piece that I was able to take all of that history and put it here in the museum.
Yeah.
They spent $1 billion.
Wow.
Over 33 years in motorsports.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
You could fund a lot with that for sure.
They when they couldn't advertise on TV anymore, that was the direction that they took, and that was it was very creative. You had Ralph Seagraves, which was the first person that went out and made the deals with the tracks. The deal was that Junior Johnson came to Reynolds and made a proposal, and basically from the proposal they said, well, Junior, we'll help you find a sponsor, but we don't want to sponsor you, we want to sponsor the series.
And a lot bigger than just sponsoring one car.
And then, they started, and then T. Wayne Robertson, which became head of sports marketing, drove the show car, and there's a picture of him with 2 Miss Winstons.
I'm about to say that that is a heck of a picture. T. Wayne was a lucky man that day.
And we have Marilyn Green's. That's her original outfit that she wore. She has an advertising agency, Green Ford, and she's married to Mr. Green that owns the Ford stores and stuff in Greensboro.
Oh, okay, that's so cool. It's funny because as long as Winston was in the sport and was Cup racing, I know people nowadays that are my age. I'm 31 that will still a lot of times when referring to NASCAR refer to it as Winston Cup. Like
right.
It still has not, even though they got out of it in 03, there was so much of that, of like our childhoods wrapped up in that. And I mean, obviously you're a little older than me. So a lot of your adulthood that was just wrapped up in that it still hasn't broken, and I think a lot of that is just because of how good a time it was. I mean, I know NASCAR had been around since '49, but that period with Winston from '71 to '03 was,
Right.
I mean, it was probably the best era there was, but definitely the most popular.
Well, you've got Bowman Gray Stadium, and believe it or not, Bowman Gray Stadium is one of my oldest customers. Dale Penless and I, back when they used to give away a little Ford Fiesta. And so about 84, 85, I was doing stuff for Bowman Gray. And Jeff Bird, that worked at sports marketing, was a manager, and then became the director for Bristol Motor Speedway. And he passed away about 10 years ago. It's, God, time flies. But I went to meet with him, and I had been doing, for the creative services at Reynolds, I'd been doing work for them, and that was pretty much how the press conference came for the Winston. And I went to him with a stack of 4x6 pictures and said, hey, these are all the things that I'm doing for JKS. And he looked through about a third of them and says, well, you can do anything that we need. And it started that relationship, and I'm very proud of the time that I got to do. We still do work for Reynolds, and Reynolds is a great company, and things, with everything, marketing changes. I mean, we're marketing now for the millennial. We're not marketing for
the old blue collar male that maybe you used to in the '80s.
So we're not. Yeah, it's kind of like I still try to figure out what generation I am, or if I'm a baby boomer. I think the baby boomers are behind me a little bit.
There you go.
I think all the things that Reynolds did with NASCAR at the tracks with the series sponsorship, they also helped find sponsors for the teams. If it, Bud Moore, Richard Childress Piedmont, Maxwell House Coffee, Budweiser. Reynolds was an integral part of helping the teams find Fortune 500 companies to be sponsors.
Who can talk to them better than someone that is one of them?
Right. So, like Goody's headache powder is today, I would say, the longest running supporting sponsor of NASCAR that I know of. Actually, they, the Goody's Headache Award, how can you forget that? And you mentioned about the Cup. Well, there were lots of discussions when it went from Winston to Nextel, and then Nextel to Sprint, and then Sprint to Monster. Everybody was trying to figure out how to get rid of the word Cup. Well, the Cup came basically designed, it was the Winston Cup. It's a trophy that has the Cup on it.
Yeah, because previously it was called like Grand National.
It was the Grand National Series.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have a series sponsor. So Bill France with Miss Hawkins, she lived over off on Country Club Road. Bowman Gray being the longest running NASCAR sanctioned track in the United States. So it's kind of cool. It's still here in the back, in the backyard, not really, but in the backyard of Reynolds, and they race, the Madhouse, and that racing is. That type of racing is what was created through that 33 years. And the innovation, by having sponsors, the cars were able to change. You used to be able, through the 70s and the 80s, you could have a bad car with a good motor or vice versa, but if you had a good driver, it could overcome it. And then the technology that came into the cars in the late 90s, in early 2000, was still very creative. You hung the body of the car with the world. So if you put the car on the jack stands, it looked like it was on banking. Now the cars are, they're laser through inspection. What's going to happen in 2021? It's like that Revell model kit that we all built as a kid. It's going to be whose glue sticks the best.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the innovation's gone. You can't ever really say it was cheating. I say it was trying to take the envelope to the fullest and figuring it out. There's a Smoke and Joe car here that was built in Ingleholla. It has the last motor that came out of Ingleholla that C.V. Raines built, and it was Jimmy Spencer's Speedway car. And if you start looking at it, the fuel cells push back, the front tread width is narrower. I don't know how Jimmy Jimmy was your size. I don't even know how he got through the window to get in the seat.
A little Crisco, maybe.
Yeah, it had to be. But those pieces of being able to build cars, Ed Barrier and I raced 299 races together in the truck, the Craftsman series. It was Craftsman with the truck, and then the Busch series, and what was the Cup series. And we made our first Cup race. I still have that car in 96, 96. Darlington, we qualified 33rd, and it was the first Cup race I'd ever tried to make with Ed. He had made a race in 95. We looked at doing something. He drove a Perina dog chow car for another guy. We were going to try to make the race, and he was able to drive for him. He had a sponsor. I didn't have a sponsor. But Bill Davis is a good friend of mine, and we made the race, and Bill Davis, big old guy. Well, Bill comes up to me and goes, "Will, you just can't go gather up a bunch of ball players and go play in the NBA." I said, "Well, Bill, if you need to put some of your sponsors on a car," I said, "I got some room."
Yeah.
But he was he was mad, and we out qualified like Darrell Waltrip and a few others, so it was pretty exciting.
So I'd like to get a little bit on your involvement. You talked earlier about going to a race at Rockingham, with your dad and stuff, and
it was my friend's dad.
Oh, it's your friend's dad. Okay. So
Curtis Stevens.
Yeah. Was that kind of your first involvement in racing, or had you kind of gotten learned about it at a younger age, or at a like a more local track than like say a Rockingham?
No, I think we went. His dad had a Winnebago, and Gene had his son, my friend, had a 71 Mini Trail 50, and I had a 71 Mini Trail 50, and we took them and we camped out in the infield. I still remember it. Had big old 55-gallon drums burning and whatever. And this was the first year of the series, and Mr. Stevens had gotten tickets because he worked in manufacturing for Reynolds, and he actually ended up retiring. So after that, I'd had go-karts prior to that, mini bikes, had the Mini Trail 50. I was 11 years old. The next step was buying the model cars.
Yeah.
So I still have all the model cars I built back when I was 11 or 12, 13. I still have them, and it's like a, Richard Petty car, and a Cale Yarborough car, or whoever. But that was kind of like it was a motorhead, a gearhead. Yeah. Do I like to drive fast? Yeah. Do I still go drive? I go to England to Goodwood. Yeah. It was very impressionable. What I saw through the next decade, I became a race fan. Would go to Bowman Gray in the 70s when I was a teenager. Actually, if I say this, the first race I ever raced was the Demolition Derby at Bowman Gray Stadium.
Oh, wow. You're lucky your head didn't get caved in.
So I had I think it was like a 73 Mercury that I bought, and what I remember is it collapsed all the way to almost to the back of the driver's seat.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, yeah. You could have been gone.
Yeah. And it was, I was trying to think of the announcer that used to announce over there, but so being around it, and then as the 80s came, and I had a real desire to be a driver, and I met Ed, and Ed had been running the Baby Grand Series, and had built a car for the Busch Series, and he was going to race. It was 86 or 7, and I kept thinking, I might figure out how to go do this, and then I figured out, well, you can't have two drivers in one car, so I let Ed drive, and I went out and found sponsorship.
Okay, and so that was kind of your first hit in the business side of it.
So with that, as it went, like in 89, we built a car to go to Daytona for the Busch Series. He had his shop at his dad's house and another little shop hit at his house, and we built the car from scratch, the chassis. Ed, and we started in July, and we built this car. We went to Daytona, and he made the race.
Wow!
But
you could never do that nowadays.
There's not even in all 3 series now. There's less than a half a dozen that can build a car and go drive at 200 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And back in the day, that's what everybody did. Wendell Scott, Richard Petty, Lee Petty, everybody, they built their own cars. Started basically with a factory stock car and converted it to a race car.
Souped it up and stuff.
Yeah.
Did you have a favorite driver back then? Or maybe it's just some favorites in general?
No, I have to say that Richard Petty was probably and that probably came from Mr. Stevens. He was a big Petty fan, and watching, Richard was so personable to everyone. He's the last man standing to sign an autograph. That's why he became the king, and I get to see him a couple times a year, and he's fascinating. His memory is incredible. We were over in England this past year, and he was talking to Al Unser, and I think it was Al Unser, and they were talking about different races, and I was sitting there, and he's talking about the last turn, and I asked him about, he had a Buick, and he was talking about where he finished with this Buick. He can remember everything, which is amazing.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's fun to listen to him.
You'd think he'd get away with forgetting a few things, but
no. And I think that's, my mother's going to be 92, and she works at a consignment shop and done it for 40 years, and I think that's what keeps them young. They stay busy. They've got something to do every day. Richard, just like Richard Childress, he's got his grandkids, and he's, Mike Dillon's a good friend of mine, and just watching the transition of family within the sport, and that was a big part of it. It was a family sport. It's a generational sport. It may be more generational in the driver owner than it is now as far as the fan base. I don't even say that the older generation still has the passion. The younger generations coming up don't really understand it was a family sport. So, and you, just like a football team, you picked your driver and you had your second driver. I remember, and I was talking about this last week, I remember being in Atlanta, and Alan Kawicki had to lead the most laps, and he beat Bill Elliott by 1 point and won the championship.
Yeah.
And he came out of nowhere, and he was an engineer. And Alan, his engineering ability, being able to build a car and drive it, which was very similar to most of the drivers at the time, had built their cars and drove it in the lower series up. Maybe not so if they were driving for Junior Johnson or Bud Moore or the Wood Brothers, but they had the knowledge. And now that knowledge, it's kind of like, if you look at where I think it's going to be in 2021, it's kind of like when the IROC series.
Yeah.
You drew a straw and you got a car.
Yeah, it was kind of see who can draft up here and get it.
Yeah.
You know what kind of got me, you're talking about having all these cars through York with JKS, and now that I kind of jogged my memory back a little bit, because the way I was as a race fan as a kid, I was going to, I grew up in Burlington, so A Speedway in Elon was kind of my home track for Friday nights.
Been there.
And I would remember kind of show cars coming out there and all the souvenirs and stuff. And I didn't get to go to a lot of cup races until I was kind of 12 and 14, because no one wanted to take a kid younger than 10 to a 500-mile race.
Right.
So
Long
probably
day.
A lot of those cars that I saw early on that were, to me as a kid, oh, that's the cup car, was because of all the cars y'all were doing at JKS to do stuff like that. And it was like, oh man, I could touch it. I couldn't get a pit pass as a kid to a cup race, but I could go to Ace or Orange County, or if they did like a sponsor thing or something, and see like a JKS car. And that was real to me, you know.
Yeah, and I think the thing that, you know, Reynolds started out with the glass car, what we call, and then in '71, then by '73 they had a Dodge Coronet and, or a Charger. I'm gonna call it a Charger, and a couple other cars that, you know, whether different manufacturers, and they supported the manufacturers, whether we built a, you know, if it was a Chrysler product or a Ford or a GM product. And the next, the teams didn't have show cars, so the cars that they would show were actually race cars. So it might have been a speedway car or something that they weren't going to use. And at that particular time, the growth of that, the second show car program we ever had was Goody's headache powders, which is actually the Dodge Daytona that's sitting behind us. It's a '71 Dodge Daytona. It was Dave Marcus's super speedway car, and it was built by Petty. It has a 426 Hemi. It runs, but it was the Goody show car for a decade.
Wow.
And when it had been mothballed, it was in the warehouse. And when I was trying to figure out how to end the 33 years, the idea was, I went to Reynolds. I said, take this 70, it raced in '71, take this '71 Dodge Daytona. It was just blue. We'll redo it, do a Winston Cup paint scheme on it, and get Richard Petty to drive it at Miami for the last race. And there's a picture of him driving it there. And it was a bittersweet day. The one thing I remember about that day was when the 43 car field started up, and we started the '71 with the Hemi in it.
Yeah.
You could hear it over the 43 cars.
Wow, it was that much louder.
It was that much louder. And it was, you know, it was a great day. And Reynolds again was very committed to the sport. The teams were committed to the sport. NASCAR at the time was committed to the sport. It was a family sport. It was accessible on TV. There was creativity and camaraderie among the teams. And, you know, before Reynolds got into it, they were running 60 in the Grand National Series. They were running 60 races a year.
All over the place.
Yeah, all over the place, twice a weekend. So, like Wendell Scott's car here in the museum is a '71 Mercury Cyclone that was wrecked in the Winston 500 in 1973 because Bill France wanted to start, Senior wanted to start 60 cars. And they had a big pile up in the first 20 laps, and it took out 18 cars. And the car that Wendell had, you know, Wendell's career was very colorful compared to Junior Johnson's. He started as a moonshiner in Virginia and got a job because a track promoter went to the Virginia Highway Patrol and said, who's the best moonshiner in the state of Virginia? They said, Wendell Scott. And they said, why is that? He said, we've never caught him. and Wendell ran 500 races. He had the Wood brothers helped him, Bud Moore, everybody helped him. And he bought this car from a gentleman named James Hammer Mason. They built the lightweights for Ford Motor Company.
That guy sounded like he should have been in boxing, not in racing.
Yeah, James Hammer Mason. And his company was called Dearborn Steel and Tubing. And Cale Yarborough and a couple other drivers drove that car, but Wendell ended up with that car, and Wendell built his own motors in his garage, and he was, my understanding was having a hard time getting the car up to speed, so he was loaned a motor from the Wood brothers. He made the race and had the wreck, and the car's, as it was, wrecked in 1973, and somebody says, why don't you restore it? And I said, why would you restore the Titanic?
Yeah.
You know, it's a piece of history. But all the cars, there's 40-some cars that are related to the museum. We've loaned them to the Guggenheim, I loaned them to Darlington, I loaned them to Talladega. We keep about 20-some cars in the museum at all times, and we change them up. So I have a 43 Richard Petty car that's not in here right now, a 42 Kyle Petty Silver Bullet Sabco car. So pretty much the teams, all the teams that were represented through those 3 decades that were running every week, whether it was Junie Donlevy out of Richmond or Bill Elliott out of Dawsonville, Georgia. There's a car that represents the periods.
Yeah. Because of how involved you were on your end of the business, Winston sponsorship of the series comes to a close there in the early 2000s. Did you have any kind of indicator some years out that it was kind of coming, or did it kind of come all of a sudden that this thing's going to come to an end and let's wrap it up and finish as strong as we can?
We knew, just like the Winston Racing Series changed because, or pretty much kind of, there were a couple factors with it. I mean, NASCAR had changed the age limit to race in the series. The progression of the tobacco industry and the way they had to market had changed. The Master Settlement Agreement caused them more limitations. We did the Winston, and then we did the Winston Million. You know, that was a great program. And then we did the No Bull 5.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, the cars had the orange numbers on them and stuff.
So we were able to, like JKS, to be able to support all those programs. The No Bull 5 was a fan and a driver, pretty much, and if they won, each got $1 million. And I think it was, if I remember correctly, we did 5 years of it, and over the 5 years, I think it was about a dozen times that the No Bull 5 was won by a driver, which was really cool. I mean, I was at Darlington doing the Winston Million, and Dale Jarrett unfortunately got into the wall. He'd won 2 of the races. If he'd won that one, he would have won the $1 million. And unfortunately, the car that got accused of putting the oil on the track that caused him to go in the wall was my car.
Oh, no.
I have the bottle that he didn't get in my office. But it wasn't us, it was Brett Bodine.
There we go.
And Brett Bodine had bought the team from Junior, and a good friend of mine, Harold Day, that owns David E. Day, was one of the NASCAR officials, and we were able to figure out the timing and whatever. But it was, it was kind of like, and my thing was, when everybody was upset at me, it was Robert Yates or racing the piece. I said, well, I saved Reynolds $750,000. I don't know what anybody's upset about. That was the only comeback I had.
That's a pretty good one, though.
Yeah.
I mean,
I got $250,000 because Reynolds didn't. The thing at Reynolds, they didn't insure it. They didn't do like Lords of London. I mean, it was a fair deal. They weren't gambling. They wanted the drivers to win.
Yeah, it's more publicity. I mean, it's more something to talk about.
And I had a sponsor. I'll tell you how crazy it is, sponsors and getting sponsors in. And '92, Speedway Scene wrote this story that 3 Star Motorsports, which is the name of my race team, Ed and his dad, said that we should get an award for the most sponsors in any given year in NASCAR. Yeah, because I'd have a primary, but I always told Ed by Saturday, I said, I'll have something for the hood. And I just kept digging, and we were able to pay our way. And we did it for, God, 2 decades doing, and not knowing if you were going to have the sponsorship. But it changed, and it has changed. And I mean, where you used to be able to go and race on a cup car in the 80s for less than $3 million, they want $25 million a day, and they're not even getting $15 million now.
I remember Mark Martin. He was talking on his podcast. I think he was talking about in 1989, Rusty Wallace, who would end up being the champion, was
Blue Max Racing, Raymond Beal.
Yeah, he was ecstatic because he was like, man, I got $1 million sponsorship, for the year, and Mark was like, yeah, nowadays that'll buy you about 3 races. Yeah, it just got so expensive.
It's $375 to, depending on the team, it's $375 to $500,000 a race, which is crazy. I mean, I think even if you took Hendricks when Junior was still driving, I did the support piece for Nationwide for a decade. I did 3 years prior to them becoming the series sponsor for the Busch Series. You know, it kind of Busch left, then it was nationwide. And then I did Xfinity. So I was able to, you know, the truck series was, you know, Craftsman. So I kind of like the first couple of decades, the transition was there, and then at the end. So Reynolds, I guess to get back to the question, I knew in 2001, I definitely knew in 2002 when the drag racing series was being ended, and I knew relatively pretty much toward the end of 2 that 3 was it.
Yeah.
And we had to figure it out. But they were spending $35 million a year, and then they were spending another $50+ million supporting it, the series sponsorship.
Wow.
And when Nextel came in, Nextel gave NASCAR $70 million a year. And I'll never forget, they wanted to know, we were on a call about all the signage at the tracks, and they said, well, how do we decide about the track signage, et cetera, da, 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 da. And I said, well, it's just basically what you want to pay for. And they go, what do you mean pay for? The $70 million a year doesn't get us any signage. I said, no, that's just the rights to the series.
Yeah.
So we ended up to convert the tracks in 2004. It was almost $2 million to change the signage at all the tracks.
No one thinks about that. Everybody just sees a sign.
Yeah, but it was a $2 million changeover, you know, and knowing that we were limited on time, and as I've told a lot of people that have wanted to do internships and things, I've missed more planned meals than you've had.
Yeah.
Because of being in NASCAR, and if you think it's glory, it's not. And we would always find out that by the 10th race, you were either dedicated and you could make it a whole season, but most people that went to work in NASCAR after about 10 races, you'd never see them again.
Just fell out. The attrition rate would get them.
It was unreal. And the same, not so much for the teams and the drivers, because they were competitors. And luckily I was a competitor, not a race fan. I've never asked a driver for an autograph, and I've been with all of them. That they did sign the car there, the Superbird, the Daytona, and we did a deal for Noble 5 down in Talladega, this place, Selwood Farms. It was a skeet shooting contest, and actually Mark Sharon, that works for me, has been with me for 2 decades. We won the skeet shooting contest, and I had my acrylic trophy, and Richard Childress said, hey, let me sign that. And I said, no, you're going to ruin my trophy. Leave it alone. And he pulls out a Sharpie and he signs it. And the next thing I know, Dale signs it, Mark Martin signs it, and the other 2 that were in the Noble 5 deal. Was kind of funny. And I don't have a lot of racing paraphernalia, but I have that at home, because I told him, I stood there and looked at him and said, guys, y'all ruined my trophy.
Yeah, I didn't want you, John Hancock,
I didn't
on
want
this.
it. I didn't want it. But, for me, to do both aspects of it, take the history, create the museum, which we opened in May of 2005. So it's been here a decade and a half, which is phenomenal. I do credit Richard Childress when I said, what do I do with all this stuff? And he says, well, you don't have a choice but open a museum.
Yeah.
And after we lost Dale, I was able to restore 80% of the cars that are at RCR. The ones from the Noble 5 programs to all the different times that Dale, won a championship. The bottles, the Noble 5, all those banners, all the things. If you go to RCR, are things that were produced at JKS for the teams, and all the other teams. Hendricks has got things. Roush, all of them have products that were produced because of Winston, what JKS did, and now we're able to preserve it in museums like the Winston Cup Museum.
Well, I'll tell you, the one thing I've learned the most about Winston sponsorship that I maybe didn't realize at the time, but I realize now, Winston red paint takes a long time to fade away. Because North Wilkesboro, sitting in its state, I think its last race was 96, because I got to go to that last race. That red paint, it might be faded, but you can still tell what it says. Y'all picked a good color.
So Dan Henley, that was over the Winston Racing Series, we'd order paint at the end of the year for the following year, because it usually had to burn up budgets, is what I'd call it. And we'd get pallets of 5-gallon buckets of red paint, and then we would ship every track the quantity of paint. We had a master list. Then we'd ship it to them, and then how it worked for like the Cup Series to the Racing Series, everything, because Reynolds was always re-innovating what they were going to give away or whatever. All of the leftover, not to say leftover, but the things that we had for the Cup Series, we would put together for the individual Winston Racing Series tracks for their banquets. So we would send, ashtrays, lighters, premiums, all these different things for them to be able to have to do a banquet. If it was cups and flags, we produced all the flags for the tracks. And from that, doing what we did for Reynolds for the tracks, then the tracks would have JKS do stuff. So it was a win-win situation.
Gotcha. Well, I appreciate you taking time. No. And I love learning about this stuff, man. This is a lot of this stuff is so, not to make you sound old, I don't mean that, but it's so much that was just before my time that I love learning and stuff. So I really appreciate what you're doing.
I think there are things that we find here at the museum, and I look for things that were produced by Reynolds, not one-offs or things that were done for different promotions or had the rights. But Reynolds, just want to say this, innovative, creative, their sports marketing team was the best there was. And a lot of those guys are now retiring. Grant Lynch just retired from Talladega. A lot of them moved on to racetracks after 2003. So it's neat to see. There's a cart back there that has everybody's name that worked at sports marketing over that 33 years. And we lose a few of them every now and then, but it was good. Maybe one day from this podcast, if the people that are listening will come to the museum, it's an event center, we do birthday parties, we've done weddings, we can do anything you want.
You've done weddings here?
Yeah. Well, we did, excuse me, we did.
If that ain't American,
they renewed their vows here.
Oh, okay.
They renewed their vows here, but we would do a wedding here. So
if that ain't American, I don't know what is.
But there are people, if you read the book, and I want to say you read the guest book, most of what they say is thank you for preserving that 33 years.